December 1941. The temperature outside is hovering near 20 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Through the frost-cracked lenses of Carl Zeiss binoculars, officers of the German 258th Infantry Division can see the flashes of anti-aircraft fire illuminating the night sky. When the smoke clears for just a fraction of a second, they can see the prize. The onion domes of the Kremlin. They are standing in the suburbs of Khimki, barely 12 miles from the center of the Soviet capital. The swastika is within a 2-hour march of being hoisted over Red Square. History tells us that this was the high water mark of the Wehrmacht, the moment the German war machine froze to death in the snows of Russia, eventually being pushed all the way back to the rubble of Berlin. But what if the dice had rolled differently? What if Army Group Center had not been delayed by the diversion to Kiev in August? What if the autumn rains had come just a week later, or the winter freeze had been just a few degrees milder? What if Adolf Hitler had actually taken Moscow in the winter of 1941? Would capturing a few square miles of frozen brick and mortar really break the back of the Soviet bear? Or would it have merely been a repeat of Napoleon's hollow victory in 1812, trapping a conquering army in a burning city with no way out? Let me know what you think down in the comments, and while you are down there, hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and welcome to the War Room. Today, we are going to tear apart the operational blueprints, the logistical nightmares, and the sheer kinetic reality of the move that could have fundamentally rewritten the 20th century. To understand the gravity of Moscow in 1941, we have to strip away the romanticized myths of World War II and look at the cold, hard, strategic bedrock that had been laid down decades earlier. The conflict between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union did not just materialize out of thin air on June 22, 1941. It was the culmination of a bizarre, almost schizophrenic military relationship that began in the ashes of the First World War. Back in 1922, the Weimar Republic and Soviet Russia signed the Treaty of Rapallo, a secret agreement between the two ultimate outcast nations of Europe. Because the Versailles Treaty heavily restricted the German military, the Germans needed a place to secretly test their new weapons and tactics, and the Soviets needed German engineering expertise. For over a decade, German officers traveled to the Soviet Union to train. They tested early tank prototypes at the Kama Tank School near Kazan, and they perfected aerial combat tactics at the Lipetsk Fighter Pilot School. The men who would eventually lead the panzer divisions into Russia had literally learned their trade on Russian soil, shoulder to shoulder with the very Soviet officers they would later be tasked with destroying. But this strange bedfellow dynamic was violently shattered by two massive geopolitical earthquakes. The first was the rise of Adolf Hitler and his explicit doctrine of Lebensraum, or living space, which openly declared that Germany's destiny lay in conquering the vast, resource-rich lands of the East. The second was Joseph Stalin's catastrophic Great Purge of the Red Army in 1937 and 1938. Stalin's paranoia led to the execution or imprisonment of roughly 35,000 military officers. He wiped out 3 of his 5 field marshals, including the brilliant Mikhail Tukhachevsky, the primary architect of the Soviet deep battle doctrine. He executed 13 of his 15 army commanders and the vast majority of his corps and division commanders. Stalin effectively decapitated his own military, replacing seasoned veterans with politically reliable but tactically incompetent loyalists. When Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, they were hitting an army that was massive in numbers, but suffering from a severe traumatic brain injury. So why was Moscow the ultimate prize? Why did German High Command, the OKH, obsess over this specific geographic coordinate? To an American audience, it is easy to think of Moscow simply as a political capital, like Washington, D.C. If an enemy took Washington, it would be a massive psychological blow. But the industrial might of the Midwest and the financial power of New York would still function. Moscow was entirely different. The Soviet Union was a vast, sprawling landmass with a severely underdeveloped road network. Almost all heavy transport relied on the railways. And the Soviet railway system was designed like a giant spider web, with Moscow sitting dead center as the primary hub. If you wanted to move coal from the Donbas in the south to the factories in the north, it routed through Moscow. If you needed to shift troops from the Far East to the European theater, they passed through the Moscow rail yards. Moscow was the Washington, C. The Chicago rail hub and the Detroit manufacturing sector of the Soviet Union all rolled into one massive metropolitan target. Severing Moscow from the Soviet Empire would not just lower the hammer and sickle flag, it would amputate the central nervous system of the entire Soviet logistical network. Let us look at the combatants who were converging on this critical junction. Spearheading the drive on Moscow was Army Group Center, commanded by Field Marshal Fedor von Bock. For this specific operation, codenamed Typhoon, von Bock was handed an unprecedented concentration of combat power. He commanded nearly 2 million men, supported by 14,000 artillery pieces and roughly 1,000 tanks. More importantly, he possessed 3 of the 4 Panzer Groups available on the entire Eastern Front. Heinz Guderian commanded the 2nd Panzer Group. Striking from the south, Hermann Hoth led the 3rd Panzer Group in the north, and Erich Hauptner drove the 4th Panzer Group right down the center. The German tactical doctrine was rooted in Bewegungskrieg, the war of maneuver. We often call it blitzkrieg, but that was a media buzzword, not a military manual term. The core of this doctrine was Auftragstaktik, or mission-type tactics. German commanders were given an objective and the assets to achieve it, but they were not micromanaged on how to get it done. This decentralized command allowed German panzer commanders to exploit gaps in the enemy line instantly, bypassing strong points to encircle and annihilate massive pockets of Soviet troops. At the tip of this spear were the Panzer I and Panzer IV tanks. By late 1941 standards, the Panzer III, equipped with a 50mm main gun, was a highly efficient, ergonomically brilliant machine. It had a dedicated 3-man turret crew, a commander, a gunner, and a loader, which gave it a massive tactical advantage in target acquisition and rate of fire over Soviet tanks. But here is the fatal flaw in the German war machine, the dirty little secret that Hollywood movies rarely show. The Wehrmacht was not a fully mechanized juggernaut. It was essentially a 2-tiered military. You had the highly mobile panzer and motorized divisions leading the charge, but they were tethered to a massive, slow-moving infantry force that relied almost entirely on horses. The German army invaded the Soviet Union with over 600,000 horses. They dragged the artillery, they pulled the supply wagons, and they moved the field kitchens. As the panzers raced hundreds of miles ahead, the infantry and the supplies had to walk behind them at a speed of maybe 15 miles a day. This created a massive, vulnerable logistical tail that stretched all the way back to the railheads in Poland. And speaking of railheads, we have to talk about the track gauge. Standard European railway tracks are 4 feet 8.5 inches wide. The Russian railway tracks were broad gauge, measuring exactly 5 feet wide. This meant that not a single German supply train could roll directly into the Soviet Union. Every single bullet, every gallon of synthetic fuel, every ration of bread had to be unloaded at the border and transferred to captured Soviet trains, assuming the retreating Soviets had not destroyed the rolling stock. The German railway engineering troops, the Eisenbahntruppen, had to manually rip up and relay thousands of miles of track while under constant partisan attack. By the time Army Group Center reached the outskirts of Moscow, their supply lines were stretched over 600 miles long, bleeding efficiency with every passing mile. Standing in their way was a Red Army that had been bled white but was fundamentally refusing to die. By October 1941, the Soviets had suffered unimaginable losses. In the encirclements at Minsk, Smolensk, Kiev, and Vyazma-Bryansk, the Germans had captured or killed nearly 3 million Soviet soldiers. To put that into perspective, that is the equivalent of wiping out the entire active-duty United States military twice over in the span of 4 months. Yet, the German intelligence apparatus, the Fremde Heer Ost, had catastrophically miscalculated the Soviet ability to generate reserves. They assumed that once the pre-war standing army was destroyed, the Soviet Union would collapse. They did not account for the brutal, ruthless efficiency of the Soviet mobilization system. Commanding the defense of Moscow was General Georgy Zhukov, a man who had cut his teeth fighting the Japanese at Khalkhin Gol and had just stabilized the desperate situation in Leningrad. Zhukov was not a man of finesse. He was a blunt instrument, a master of operational depth and attritional warfare, who was perfectly willing to trade rivers of Soviet blood for a few miles of ground. Under his command, the Soviets were deploying a weapon that had profoundly shocked the German high command. The T-34 medium tank. When the Germans first encountered the T-34, it induced a phenomenon they called Panzer Panic. The T-34 featured heavily sloped armor, which artificially increased the thickness of the steel and caused standard German 37mm anti-tank shells to simply bounce off. It was armed with a powerful 76 2mm gun that could punch through any German tank on the battlefield. More importantly for the terrain, it utilized a Christie suspension system with incredibly wide tracks. This lowered the ground pressure of the 30-ton tank, allowing it to glide over mud and snow that would down a standard German Panzer. While the early T-34s suffered from terrible ergonomics, lacking radios, and forcing the commander to also act as the gunner, it was a rugged, brutal machine perfectly adapted to the harsh environment of its homeland. But the real strength of the Soviet Union in late 1941 was not just in their tanks, it was in their strategic depth and industrial resilience. As the Germans advanced, the Soviet government executed the largest industrial evacuation in human history. Over 1,500 massive factories, producing everything from aircraft engines to artillery shells, were literally dismantled piece by piece. They were loaded onto thousands of rail cars and shipped hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles east, behind the safety of the Ural Mountains. In the freezing cold, Soviet workers, mostly women and teenagers, rebuilt these factories in the open snow, starting production lines before the roofs were even constructed over their heads. While the German industrial base in the Ruhr Valley was still operating on a peacetime, single-shift schedule, producing luxury goods alongside munitions, the Soviet economy had become a total war machine. This brings us to a critical historical comparison. Are there precedents for an army capturing an enemy's capital but still losing the war? Absolutely. We only have to look back to 1812, when Napoleon Bonaparte's Grande Army marched into Moscow. Napoleon believed that capturing the historic capital would force Tsar Alexander I to sue for peace. Instead, the Russians burned their own city to the ground, denying the French army winter quarters and supplies. Napoleon sat in the ashes for a month, waiting for a surrender that never came, before being forced into a disastrous retreat that destroyed his empire. Or consider the American Civil War. For years, the Union Army of the Potomac was obsessed with capturing the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia. General after general threw their men into the meat grinder trying to take the city, failing to realize that the true center of gravity was not the drill estate, it was General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. It was not until Ulysses S. Grant took command and shifted the strategic focus to relentlessly grinding down Lee's army, regardless of the geographic location, that the Union finally won the war. Was the German high command making the exact same mistake? Were they so fixated on the psychological and geographical prize of Moscow that they were ignoring the fact that the Red Army was still a functioning, lethal entity? By November 1941, the German advance was not just fighting the Red Army, it was fighting the Russian environment itself. First came the Rasputitsa, the seasons of bad roads. The autumn rains turned the unpaved Russian road network into a bottomless ocean of thick, viscous mud. German trucks, designed for the paved highways of Western Europe, sank to their axles. The horse-drawn supply wagons became completely immobilized. The vaunted blitzkrieg ground to a halt, moving at a pace of 1 or 2 miles a day. Then, in mid-November, the temperature plummeted. The mud froze solid. For a brief moment, the German mechanized units could move again, and they launched their final desperate lunge toward the capital. But the cold kept dropping, reaching temperatures that Central Europeans simply could not comprehend. The German military was utterly unprepared for winter warfare. They lacked winter clothing, forcing soldiers to stuff newspapers into their tunics to stave off frostbite. More critically, their equipment began to fail. The synthetic oil used in German tank engines and aircraft froze into a thick, useless tar. To start a Panzer, the crew had to light a fire under the engine block, a highly dangerous procedure. The lubricants in their standard issue K98 Mauser rifles and MG34 machine guns froze solid, rendering the weapons completely useless in a firefight. The optical sights on their artillery pieces frosted over. The Soviet equipment, however, was designed for this exact environment. Their weapons used special winterized lubricants. Their soldiers were equipped with felt Valenki boots and heavily padded Telegreka jackets. And thanks to their master spy in Tokyo, Richard Sorge, Stalin had received rock-solid intelligence that the Empire of Japan was going to strike south at the United States and the British Empire, not north into Siberia. This allowed Zhukov to transfer 18 fully equipped, winter-trained Siberian divisions from the Far East directly to the defense of Moscow. These were fresh, highly motivated troops stepping off the trains right into the defensive lines. This is the exact tactical situation as the German vanguard reaches the suburb of Khimki. The German spearheads are exhausted, freezing, operating at less than 30% of their authorized vehicular strength, and dangling at the end of a 600-mile logistical thread. The Soviet defenders are battered but reinforcing, backed against the wall of their own capital, and armed with weapons that actually function in the sub-zero hellscape. The stage is perfectly set for the final brutal collision that will decide the fate of the world. The order is given to push into the urban sprawl, to cross the final 12 miles, and to plant the flag on the Kremlin. But as the first German tracks hit the paved streets of the Moscow suburbs, the reality of urban combat in the dead of winter is about to rewrite every tactical manual ever printed. The transition from the vast, open steppe Russia to the claustrophobic concrete canyons of an industrial metropolis completely neutralizes the German operational playbook. For the past 6 months, the Wehrmacht has relied on the doctrine of maneuver warfare, using the speed of their panzer divisions to bypass strong points, encircle massive enemy formations, and starve them into submission. But you cannot bypass a city block when your objective is the city center. You cannot outflank an apartment building when it is physically connected to 10 other apartment buildings. In the urban sprawl of Moscow, the war of maneuver instantly devolves into what the Germans would later call Rattenkrieg, or the War of the Rats. To understand why this environment is so lethal to the German war machine, we have to look at the specific tools they brought to the fight. The standard German infantryman in 1941 is armed with the Karabiner 98K, a bolt-action rifle firing a heavy 7.92mm Mauser cartridge. It is an incredibly accurate, beautifully engineered weapon, designed to kill a man at 500 yards across an open field. But in the stairwell of a Moscow tenement building, where engagement distances are measured in feet, a 5-round bolt-action rifle is a massive liability. If you miss your first shot, or if there are 2 enemies in the room, the fraction of a second it takes to manually cycle that bolt is enough to get you killed. Conversely, the Soviet defenders are heavily equipped with the PPSH-41 submachine gun. This weapon is a masterclass in brutal, utilitarian engineering. It fires the 7.62 by 25mm Tokarev pistol cartridge, a high-velocity round that can easily punch through the heavy winter coats worn by the German soldiers. More importantly, it fires from an open bolt at a staggering rate of 900 rounds per minute, feeding from a massive 71-round drum magazine. While the drum magazines are notoriously difficult to load with frozen fingers, and Soviet soldiers quickly learned to only load 65 rounds to prevent the internal spring from jamming, the sheer volume of fire it produces is devastating. When a German squad kicks open a door, they are met with a wall of lead that their bolt-action rifles simply cannot answer. How do you clear a 5-story apartment block when your primary weapon fires 1 round every 2 seconds, and the enemy is hosing down the fatal funnel with 15 rounds a second? You rely on your heavy weapons, but here again, the urban environment strips away the German advantage. The backbone of German infantry firepower is the MG-34 general-purpose machine gun. It is a marvel of pre-war engineering, capable of firing up to 900 rounds per minute. But it is built with incredibly tight machining tolerances, making it highly susceptible to jamming when exposed to the brick dust, plaster, and freezing mud of a shattered city. Furthermore, setting up a machine gun nest in a street fight is a death sentence. The moment the MG-34 opens up, its muzzle flash illuminates the firing position, drawing immediate sniper fire or a mortar barrage from the surrounding rooftops. This brings us to the armored vehicles. The Panzerwaffe I and Panzerwaffe tanks, which had terrorized Europe, suddenly become blind steel coffins in the streets of Moscow. A tank is designed to dominate open terrain through mobility and long-range firepower. In a city, its vision is restricted to the narrow slits of the commander's cupola. The main gun cannot elevate high enough to hit the upper floors of a building, and it cannot depress low enough to shoot at infantry hiding in the basement windows. If a panzer rolls down a narrow Moscow street, it is entirely vulnerable to a Soviet soldier dropping a satchel charge or a Molotov cocktail from a third-story balcony directly onto the thin armor of the engine deck. We have seen this exact tactical nightmare play out in other historical conflicts. Look at the United States Marines during the Battle of Hue City in Vietnam in 1968. The Marines were trained for jungle warfare and open field engagements. But when they were thrust into the dense, walled city of Hue, their tanks became targets, and the battle devolved into a grueling, room-by-room meat grinder. Or consider the American assault on the German city of Aachen in 1944, where U.S. infantry had to blow holes through the interior walls of row houses using bazookas just to advance down a street without stepping into the kill zones outside. Urban combat is a great equalizer, stripping away the advantages of superior command and control, and reducing the fight to a primal, bloody contest of attrition. On the morning of December 5, 1941, the hypothetical assault on the physical city of Moscow begins. The temperature stands at a bone-chilling minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit. Elements of the German 2nd Panzer Division, alongside the 106th Infantry Division, attempt to push south from Khimki down the Leningradskoye Highway, aiming directly for the Belorusky railway station, a critical gateway to the city center. The Soviet defense, orchestrated by General Zhukov, is not a thin line on the map. It is a defense in depth consisting of multiple concentric rings of fortified positions. The citizens of Moscow, primarily women and elderly men, have spent the last 2 months digging massive anti-tank ditches across the major boulevards. They have dragged thousands of steel Czech hedgehogs, welded from heavy railway rails, into the intersections. They have taken the city's electric tramcars, derailed them, packed them with concrete and rubble, and turned them into massive, immovable barricades blocking the primary avenues of approach. At 0600 hours, the German artillery attempts to soften up the Soviet positions. But the freezing temperatures have wreaked havoc on the German gun batteries. The recoil mechanisms on the 105mm howitzers are sluggish because the hydraulic fluid has thickened into a jelly-like consistency. Many of the high-explosive shells fail to detonate on impact because the ground is frozen as hard as solid granite, causing the shells to simply shatter or bounce rather than burrowing in and exploding. When the German infantry finally steps off the line of departure, they are moving through knee-deep snow, completely exhausted before the first shot is even fired. As the lead elements of the 106th Infantry approach the first tram barricade near the Sokol metro station, the trap is sprung. Soviet snipers, armed with the Mosin-Nagant M9130 rifle equipped with PU telescopic sights, are positioned in the attic vents of the surrounding apartment buildings. They do not target the regular infantrymen. They specifically target the German officers, identifiable by their peaked caps, and the radio operators, identifiable by the large antennas protruding from their backpacks. Within the first 10 minutes of the engagement, the German command structure at the platoon level is effectively decapitated. Without radios, the infantry cannot call for artillery support or coordinate with the panzers. They are pinned down behind the frozen corpses of their own comrades, taking fire from 3 different directions. Does a highly trained, ideologically motivated German stormtrooper maintain his discipline when he is freezing to death in a gutter, unable to see the enemy shooting at him? The reality is that training and discipline begin to evaporate when the human body is pushed past the limits of physical endurance. To break the deadlock, the German commanders call up their specialized combat engineers, the Pionier battalions. These men are the elite problem solvers of the Wehrmacht, armed with explosive satchel charges and the Flammenwerfer 35 flamethrower. The Flammenwerfer is a terrifying weapon, carrying over 3 gallons of highly flammable oil mixed with compressed nitrogen, capable of projecting a stream of liquid fire up to 30 yards. But carrying a 35-pound tank of freezing liquid on your back while navigating rubble makes you a slow, highly visible target. As a German pioneer attempts to maneuver around the flank of the tram barricade, a Soviet anti-tank rifle team opens fire. The Soviets are utilizing the PTRD-41, a massive single-shot rifle firing a 14.5mm tungsten core armor-piercing round. It was designed to punch through the side armor of German tanks, but in an urban environment, it is incredibly effective at punching through brick walls, sandbags, and human bodies. The 14.5mm round strikes the Pioneer's fuel tank, igniting the pressurized oil and instantly turning the man into a screaming pillar of fire, incinerating him and the two riflemen stacked up behind him. The advance down the Leningradskoy highway stalls, forcing the Germans to change their tactics. If they cannot push down the open streets, they must move through the buildings themselves. This technique, known as mouse-holing, requires the infantry to clear a building room by room, then use explosives to blow a hole through the adjoining wall into the next building, completely avoiding the street. It is a painfully slow, violently intimate form of warfare. A German squad kicks in the door of a ground-floor bakery. The air is thick with the smell of stale yeast and frozen blood. As they step into the dark room, a Soviet soldier hidden behind the counter pulls the pin on an F1 fragmentation grenade, nicknamed the Limonka, or Little Lemon. In the confined space of the bakery, the blast wave has nowhere to go. The overpressure ruptures the eardrums of every man in the room, while the cast iron shrapnel tears through their winter uniforms. The survivors blindly fire their weapons into the dust cloud, the muzzle flashes illuminating the horrific carnage. By nightfall on December 5th, the German 2nd Panzer Division has advanced less than 1 mile into the city limits. They have lost hundreds of men, and their logistical situation has gone from dire to catastrophic. The German supply trucks, struggling over the frozen, rutted roads from Smolensk, are being ambushed by Soviet partisans in the rear. The trucks that do make it to the front line are carrying the wrong supplies. They are bringing artillery shells when the men need small arms ammunition. They are bringing summer-weight motor oil when the tanks desperately need winterized lubricants. Food is practically non-existent. The German soldiers are forced to scavenge, hacking chunks of meat off the frozen carcasses of their own artillery horses with axes, boiling the meat in melted snow over tiny, smokeless fires hidden in the basements of ruined buildings. Meanwhile, deep within the Kremlin, Joseph Stalin is refusing to evacuate. His presence in the city acts as a massive psychological anchor for the Soviet defenders. He has given General Zhukov absolute authority to do whatever it takes to hold the capital. Zhukov is utilizing the city's intricate metro system, which was built deep underground to double as a massive bomb shelter, as a subterranean highway network. While the Germans are bleeding for every inch of ground on the surface, Zhukov is rapidly shifting his elite Siberian reserves underground, moving thousands of fresh troops from one sector of the city to another, completely undetected. When the Germans finally capture a city block, they are immediately hit by a massive coordinated Soviet counterattack, launching from the basement levels subway grates behind their newly established front line. This is the exact same dynamic that played out during the Battle of Manila in 1945. When General Douglas MacArthur's forces had to root out deeply entrenched Japanese defenders from the heavily reinforced concrete buildings of the Philippine capital. The Japanese used the city's sewer systems to move behind American lines, turning a simple clearing operation into a chaotic, three-dimensional nightmare where the front line existed above, below, and behind the advancing troops. By December 7th, the situation for the German spearheads inside Moscow is becoming entirely untenable. The 4th Panzer Group, pushing from the west, has managed to seize a bridgehead over the Moscow Canal, but they have no fuel to exploit the breakthrough. The tanks are literally running on fumes, forcing the crews to drain the fuel tanks of damaged vehicles just to keep the engines of the operational tanks idling to prevent them from cracking in the cold. A tank without fuel is not a mobile weapons platform. It is a static pillbox, and a static pillbox is easily outflanked and destroyed by infantry. The vaunted German Luftwaffe, which had ruled the skies over Europe, is completely grounded. The extreme cold has frozen the control cables of the Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters and the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers. The ground crews, working without gloves to manipulate delicate engine parts, are suffering from severe frostbite, losing fingers and hands to the unforgiving metal of the aircraft. Without close air support, the German infantry in Moscow is entirely on its own, fighting a fanatical enemy in a concrete labyrinth. The physical toll on the German soldier is unimaginable. Dysentery and typhus are running rampant through the ranks, exacerbated by the impossibility of maintaining any level of hygiene in the freezing rubble. Wounded soldiers, who would normally be evacuated to field hospitals, are left to freeze to death in the ruins because the medical transport vehicles cannot navigate the barricaded streets. The morphine syringes carried by the medics have frozen solid, meaning amputations and surgeries have to be performed without any anesthetic, the screams of the wounded echoing through the shattered apartment blocks. Yet, despite the horror, despite the staggering casualties, and despite the utter failure of their logistical network, the sheer tactical discipline of the German army pushes them forward. By the evening of December 8th, a vanguard unit of the SS Motorized Division Das Reich manages to punch through a weakened sector of the Soviet line near the Dynamo Stadium. They fight their way down the Leningradsky Avenue, leaving a trail of burning vehicles and frozen corpses in their wake. They reach the intersection of the Garden Ring Road, the final major defensive perimeter before the city center. Through the swirling snow and the thick black smoke of burning oil tanks, the German forward observers can see it clearly. Less than 3 miles away, the massive red brick walls and the towering spires of the Kremlin are visible to the naked eye. They have breached the gates. They have survived the gauntlet of the outer suburbs. They are within striking distance of cutting the heart out of the Soviet Empire. But as the exhausted German officers raise their binoculars to study the approaches to Red Square swords, they hear a sound that freezes the blood in their veins, a sound that signifies the beginning of a nightmare they never anticipated. It is the terrifying, unearthly shriek of the BM-13 Katyusha rocket launcher. It is a sound that German infantrymen will soon learn to fear more than artillery, a sound they will christen Stalin's organ. Mounted on the back of rugged ZIS-6 utility trucks, the Katyusha does not rely on the precision of a rifled barrel. Instead, it utilizes a series of steel launch rails to fire a massive volley of M13, 132mm high explosive fragmentation rockets. A single battery of 4 trucks can deliver nearly 5 tons of high explosives onto a target area in less than 10 seconds. Unlike conventional artillery, which provides a few seconds of warning as the shells whistle through the air, rockets arrive in a concentrated, devastating tidal wave of blast pressure and razor-sharp shrapnel. The vanguard of the Das Reich division is caught completely exposed on the wide, frozen asphalt of the Garden Ring. The shockwave shatters the remaining glass in the surrounding buildings, turning the windows into secondary fragmentation weapons. Before the smoke even clears, the ground begins to vibrate with the unmistakable rhythmic clatter of wide steel tracks. Emerging from the blinding snow squalls are dozens of fresh, white-painted T-34 tanks, carrying heavily armed Siberian shock troops riding directly on the engine decks. But let us pause the battle right here and run the ultimate historical simulation. Let us assume that the Katyusha barrage misses. The T-34 counterattack is repelled by a desperate stand of German anti-tank gunners, and Army Group Center manages to push those final 3 miles. Let us imagine the swastika flag is finally raised over the shattered domes of the Kremlin on Christmas Day, 1941. Would this monumental geographical conquest have actually won the war for Nazi Germany, or would it have merely accelerated their ultimate destruction? To answer this, we have to examine a fundamental military concept defined by the legendary Prussian strategist Karl von Clausewitz. Clausewitz wrote extensively about the culminating point of victory. This is the exact moment in a military campaign when an attacking force has stretched its supply lines, exhausted its troops, and depleted its combat power to the point where it is no longer stronger than the defending enemy. A brilliant commander knows exactly when he has reached this point, and he halts his advance to consolidate his defensive lines. Adolf Hitler and the German High Command completely ignored this doctrine. They had passed their culminating point hundreds of miles ago, somewhere in the muddy fields near Smolensk. Taking a capital city does not automatically trigger the collapse of a nation, a lesson the British Empire learned the hard way during the American Revolutionary War. In 1777, British General William Howe launched a massive campaign to capture Philadelphia, which was the political heart of the rebellion and the seat of the Continental Congress. Howe successfully outmaneuvered George Washington, marched his redcoats into the city, and assumed that the loss of the capital would break the spirit of the American colonies. Instead, the Continental Congress simply packed up their documents, relocated to the town of York, and continued to govern without missing a beat. George Washington moved his battered but intact army into winter quarters at Valley Forge, keeping his fighting force alive. The British won the real estate, but they found themselves trapped in a freezing city surrounded by hostile territory, having achieved absolutely nothing of strategic value. The capture of Philadelphia was a hollow victory that ultimately contributed to the British losing the war. Joseph Stalin had prepared the exact same contingency plan for the Soviet Union. While Stalin remained in Moscow to project strength, the entire apparatus of the Soviet government had already been evacuated 500 miles east to the city of Kuibyshev, which is modern-day Samara. Deep beneath the streets of Kuibyshev, Soviet engineers had constructed a massive subterranean bunker complex. It was buried over 100 feet underground, protected by thick slabs of reinforced concrete, and equipped with independent power generators and communication arrays. If Moscow fell, Stalin would have simply boarded a train, retreated to his impenetrable fortress behind the Volga River, and continued to direct the war. The loss of the Kremlin would have been a humiliating propaganda defeat, but it would not have stopped a single Soviet tank from rolling off the assembly lines in the Ural Mountains. However, we must address the most catastrophic consequence of losing Moscow, which is the severing of the central railway hub. Without the Moscow rail yards, the Soviet logistical network would have been severely fractured, forcing them to route trains thousands of miles out of the way to move troops from north to south. But a fractured network is not a dead network, especially when it is being artificially sustained by the greatest industrial powerhouse on the planet, the United States of America. Through the Lend-Lease Act, America was already beginning to pump an unimaginable volume of war material into the Soviet Union. We are not just talking about a few crates of ammunition. Over the course of the war, the United States would supply the Red Army with over 400,000 heavy trucks, primarily the legendary Studebaker US-6. These 2.5-ton, 6x6 trucks became the absolute backbone of Soviet logistics, giving the Red Army a level of operational mobility that the horse-drawn German army could only dream of. America sent thousands of locomotives, millions of pairs of winter boots, and enough canned meat to feed the entire Soviet military. If the northern supply route through Murmansk was cut off by the fall of Moscow, the Allies would have simply expanded the Persian corridor. This was a massive logistical pipeline running from the ports of the Persian Gulf, straight up through the deserts of Iran, and into the southern underbelly of the Soviet Union. American engineers literally built highways and railways across the Iranian mountains just to keep the Soviet bear fed and fighting. Taking Moscow would have choked the Soviet supply lines, but American industrial might would have acted as a massive logistical bypass surgery, keeping the patient alive. But the most fascinating and terrifying variable in this alternate timeline is the geopolitical ripple effect. If Moscow falls in early December 1941, the shockwaves would have hit the Imperial Palace in Tokyo with the force of a nuclear detonation. The Japanese military was deeply divided between two competing strategic factions. The Nanshin-Ron, or Southern Strike Group, favored a naval war against the United States and Britain to secure the oil fields of Southeast Asia. The Hokushin-Ron, or Northern Strike Group, favored a land war against the Soviet Union to secure the resources of Siberia. Historically, the Japanese chose the Southern Strike, leading directly to the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. But if the Japanese High Command receives intelligence that the Soviet capital has fallen and the Red Army is collapsing, the Northern Strike faction might have seized absolute control. Why risk a suicidal war with the industrial might of the United States when a wounded, bleeding Soviet Union is lying practically defenseless right in your backyard? If Japan pivots north to invade Siberia, the attack on Pearl Harbor might be delayed or canceled entirely. This creates a massive political nightmare for American President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Roosevelt desperately wanted to enter the war to defeat Nazi Germany, but he needed a direct attack on American soil to unify a deeply isolationist American public. Without Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt might have been forced to watch from the sidelines as the Axis powers carved up the Eurasian landmass, fundamentally altering the balance of global power for a century. Alternatively, the fall of Moscow might have panicked the American public enough to support a preemptive declaration of war, accelerating America's entry into the European theater. Let us look at another historical precedent that proves capturing a capital does not guarantee victory. During the War of 1812, British forces landed on the American coast, marched directly into Washington, D.C., and burned the White House and the Capitol building to the ground. It was a devastating psychological blow, but did the United States surrender? Absolutely not. President James Madison and his cabinet simply fled to the countryside. The American military regrouped, and they successfully repelled the British at the Battle of Baltimore just a few weeks later. The burning of Washington actually galvanized the American public, uniting them in a furious desire for revenge. The destruction of Moscow would have triggered the exact same psychological reaction in the Soviet populace. The war would have transformed from a defense of the state into a fanatical, holy crusade of annihilation against the German invaders. Now, let us place ourselves in the boots of a German general who has just successfully captured Moscow. Congratulations, you have won the prize, but now you have to hold it. You have just pushed 500,000 exhausted, freezing, starving German soldiers into a sprawling urban ruin. The city has been systematically rigged with explosives by the retreating secret police, meaning every basement, every bridge, and every government building is a potential death trap. You have no functioning supply lines, your tanks are out of fuel, and the winter temperatures are dropping to 40 degrees below zero. And surrounding your newly conquered city is a furious, rapidly mobilizing Soviet army of millions, equipped with winter gear and backed by untouched factories in the Urals. By taking Moscow, Adolf Hitler would not have destroyed the Soviet Union. He would have simply created the largest prisoner of war camp in human history, trapping his own best divisions inside it. The German army would have been completely encircled and slowly ground into dust in a brutal, frozen siege. It would have been the Battle of Stalingrad, but it would have happened a full year earlier and on a vastly more catastrophic scale. The loss of Army Group Center inside the ruins of Moscow would have ripped a hole in the Eastern Front so massive that the Red Army could have marched straight to Berlin by 1943. The obsessive drive to capture Moscow was the ultimate manifestation of Nazi strategic arrogance. It was a military campaign built on the delusion that willpower and ideological superiority could somehow overcome the laws of physics, the realities of logistics, and the brutal extremes of the Russian climate. They built a military machine that was perfectly designed to win a 6-week sprint in the mild weather of Western Europe, and they drove it headfirst into a multi-year marathon in the harshest environment on Earth. The failure to take Moscow was not just a tactical defeat, it was the moment the myth of German invincibility was permanently shattered. It proved that a mechanized army, no matter how highly trained or technologically advanced, is utterly useless if it cannot feed its soldiers, fuel its engines, and adapt to the environment it is fighting in. In the end, wars are not won by capturing buildings, they are won by destroying the enemy's ability and will to fight, a lesson written in blood across the frozen streets of the Russian capital. The ghost of Napoleon warned them, but arrogance is a disease that makes men blind to history. Now I want to turn it over to you. If Hitler had actually managed to capture Moscow in 1941, what do you think would have been the most significant consequence? A. The Soviet Union collapses and Germany wins the war in the East. B. Japan cancels Pearl Harbor to invade Siberia, keeping America out of the war longer. C. The German army gets surrounded and destroyed inside the city, ending the war even faster. Let me know your choice in the comments below.